everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bells that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Helen McCourt. She was a young woman who just suddenly disappeared one day during her journey home. Helen was soon reported as missing to the police, and it wasn't actually very long before they identified a main suspect in the case. And eventually they collected a mountain of evidence that indicated that this suspect murdered Helen, even though they never found her body. So for this week's case, we are going back about 34 years to 1988 in the village of Billinge, which is located within the borough of St Helens in Merseyside in England. And this is Helen McCourt. She was a 22-year-old woman and she had lived in Billinge with her family for about 8 years. They moved to the area in 1980. Helen was born on the 29th of July 1965 to her parents Mary and William McCourt. However, they were not together by the time that this case took place. They had divorced, and Mary actually had a different partner and his name was John, so he was like Helen's stepfather. Helen was one of 2 children. She had a younger brother named Michael who was a couple of years younger than her, and she absolutely adored him. Their mother Mary said that when Michael was born, he wasn't even really her baby, he was Helen's baby. Helen just wanted to look after him and take care of him all the time. She was clearly a very good big sister and she was always very close to her family. Helen was described by her family as being very outgoing, very full of fun, very funny. She had a great sense of humour. Her mum Mary said that Helen would always play these little practical jokes and she was very sociable and popular. She had a lot of friends. She loved to go out. She was the kind of person that could just talk to anyone and get along with anyone. And by 1988, at 22 years old, Helen was working as an insurance clerk at an office in Liverpool, and that is exactly what she had been doing on the day that she disappeared. The date was Tuesday the 9th of February 1988. Helen got up that morning, she travelled to work, and she did actually arrange to meet up with her mum Mary that lunchtime. They were going to go out for some food together. However, in the end, they didn't. Mary cancelled lunch because the weather that day was really bad. It was rainy, it was very windy, severe weather warnings had actually been issued, I believe. So they decided to just skip lunch that day and Helen would see her mum later at home. So Helen carried on with her day and she rang her mum a couple of times while she was still at work, just asking if firstly her grandmother was okay, because her grandmother actually had a hospital appointment that day. So Helen was asking about how that went, and she also asked her mum if she wouldn't mind making sure that her dinner was ready for when she got home later that day at around tea time. You see, she wanted to eat as soon as she got in because she had made plans that evening with her new boyfriend. His name was Frank. So Helen wanted to come home from work, quickly have her dinner, get ready, and then go out to see Frank. That was her plan for that evening. And her mum Mary said, yeah, that's fine, I'll make sure that your food is ready for when you get in. However, it got to around 5:45 that evening and Mary noticed that Helen still wasn't home. She normally got back around 5:15 p.m, but it was about half an hour later and there was no sign of her. But Mary didn't really worry too much initially because she had actually heard on the news that due to the fact that it was really bad weather, the train from Liverpool to Wigan had been delayed because a tree had been blown onto the train tracks. And Helen did get a train home from work every single day. She would get on the train at a station near her work in Liverpool. She would then get off at St Helens, and then after this she would get a bus home. So when Helen didn't come home at the normal time, her mum Mary just thought, oh, her train must have just been delayed. But then it got to around 7 p.m. and there was still no sign of Helen, and Mary did start to worry a little bit at this point because her son Michael had returned home from work okay by now, so why hadn't Helen. It was just really strange as well, because Helen was the kind of person that would always keep in contact with her family. If she knew that she was going to be late home for whatever reason, she would let them know. She would find a phone box and ring her mum, but she hadn't done that. There had been no phone call from her, and so her mum Mary actually decided to get in contact with the British rail service to find out exactly what was going on with the trains, the train that Helen would have gotten on. Mary told British Rail that Helen would have gotten off at the St Helens stop, and that was when they responded saying, oh well, Helen's train wouldn't have been affected then. The train that she would have gotten on wasn't the train that was experiencing delays. So of course this only made Mary worry even more. The only explanation she could think of as to why Helen wasn't back was that the bad weather had made her train run late, but clearly that wasn't the case. Helen's train was running as usual, so why hadn't she returned home? It was following this that Mary started panicking that maybe Helen had been injured or something on her way home. Maybe the strong winds had caused her to fall over and hurt herself. And so with this theory in mind, the family started getting in contact with hospitals in the local area and surrounding areas just to see if Helen had been taken in, but she hadn't. They also phoned Helen's office to see if she, for some reason, decided to work late, but again, she hadn't. And they got in contact with Helen's friends to see if any of them had heard from her, but unfortunately, no one had any idea where Helen was. After this, Helen's mum, her stepfather John, and her boyfriend Frank decided to actually go out and look for her themselves. They decided to go along the route that Helen took every day to get home to see if they could find her. But once again, they had no luck. And so it was following this that they knew it was time to ask the police for help. They went to a police station in Liverpool and they reported Helen as missing. One of the very first things the police did when they received this report was they alerted all of the officers that were currently on duty in Liverpool that this young woman was missing so that they could be on the lookout for her. And of course, everyone was hoping that she would be found that night, that an officer would come across her. Maybe if she had been injured due to the strong winds and she was perhaps stuck somewhere, someone would find her. But no one did, and the next morning, Helen still wasn't home. There was still no sign of her and no contact from her. So following this, the police decided that they really needed to pin down Helen's last known movements. Clearly she had vanished somewhere along her route home, but the police wanted to determine exactly where. How far did she get before she disappeared? So the police launched an appeal for witnesses. They made the media and the public aware of Helen's disappearance, and then they started their investigation at her place of work, at the office in Liverpool. They took statements from her co-workers, and then from there they focused on each point of her journey. So they carried out inquiries at the train station, they spoke to the train station staff, they spoke to people that would have been on Helen's train that night. They then carried out inquiries surrounding the bus that she would have gotten on at St Helens, and what they discovered was that Helen did actually get on both her train and her bus that evening. She didn't miss either. She was seen by witnesses on both the train and then the bus. And it turns out that the last time she was ever seen was around 5:15 p.m. when she got off the bus at her bus stop and she started walking in the direction of her house. And her bus stop was around 250 yards away from her home. It would have taken her minutes to walk back. But as we know, she never made it. So these lines of inquiry led the police to believe that Helen disappeared somewhere along that very, very short walk home in Billing. She was literally minutes away when something happened to her. All of Helen's family members and friends were obviously spoken to and looked into by the police. Her boyfriend Frank was looked into, because as with every missing persons case, there is a chance that someone the person knows is involved in their disappearance. However, the police were soon confident that none of Helen's family or friends had anything to do with whatever had happened to her. They were all just so upset and worried about her. It was clear that they they were all innocent. So after the detectives had established exactly where Helen was last seen, about 120 police officers were sent out to search around the area for her. They were looking for any trace of Helen, maybe an item of clothing that she was wearing that day. They were handing out missing posters with her face on. They were stopping cars and asking the drivers if they had seen her. Divers were sent to search the local dam, and the police also started carrying out door-to-door inquiries, asking the people who lived along the route that Helen would have walked along if they had any information, if they had seen anything suspicious on the evening that she went missing. As part of these door-to-door inquiries, the police also paid a visit to the local pub in the area. It was called the George and Dragon Pub, and it was located along Helen's route home. She would have walked past it that evening, and Helen went to that pub often. It was her local, so she would often go there with friends and family for a drink. Although something that the police quickly learned was that just 2 days before Helen's disappearance, she had actually been thrown out of the George and Dragon pub, and this happened because she had gotten into an argument with another young woman there. Apparently this woman was very, very drunk and she spilled her drink all over Helen. So Helen went to the bathroom to kind of clean herself up, but this drunk woman followed her in there and they started arguing and I think fighting a little bit. And so the landlord of the pub, a man named Ian Sims, kicked them out and he barred Helen from the pub. He told her that she wasn't allowed to come back. So anyway, as I said, a couple of days later, after Helen went missing and the police started their door-to-door inquiries, they went to the George and Dragon pub to speak to the people who worked there. Specifically, they wanted to speak to the landlord, 31-year-old Ian Sims, who had owned the pub for about a year by this point. They wanted to see if maybe he could provide any information about Helen's whereabouts. Maybe he saw her pass the pub, or maybe she even went into the pub on her way home that night. So they started asking Ian Sims just some routine questions and he was answering them and everything seemed fine and normal, until at least the pub started to get a bit busier. More customers were coming in, and so the officers asked Ian Sims if he wouldn't mind just popping down to the police station with them to answer a few more questions there because it was a lot quieter. It was when the officers asked Ian this that they noticed that he suddenly became very nervous. As soon as they mentioned him coming down to the station, he got very, very anxious and panicky. He actually started hyperventilating, and it just seemed very strange because obviously he wasn't in trouble. He wasn't being arrested for anything. This was just routine, really. So the officers quickly became quite suspicious of this guy. Why was he so nervous all of a sudden? Was it because he was perhaps guilty of something? Did he maybe know more about Helen's disappearance than he was letting on? The police soon discovered, once they looked into Ian Sims a bit more, that he was known for being a bit of a ladies' man. He was married at the time that this case took place and he had 2 children, but despite that he would constantly flirt with other women, including Helen. He would often try and flirt with her, and apparently when she was in the pub he would send her drinks for free. He would send drinks to her table, but she was not interested in him at all, so she would never really respond or interact with him. I think she just ignored him most of the time. Ian Sims was just known for being a very arrogant man. He was clearly one of those men that thought all of the ladies fancied him when, let's be honest, they probably didn't. But anyway, going back to where we were, Ian was asked to come down to the police station where officers could ask him a few more questions, and they asked him about what he had been doing on the evening that Helen McCourt went missing. And he actually said that that night he was with his mistress. Yep, he had a secret girlfriend. He was married, but he was cheating on his wife with another woman. And he told the police that on the evening that Helen McCourt vanished, he was with her, he was with his girlfriend. She came to his flat above the pub where he lived. Just a side note, he didn't actually live with his wife and children. They lived in another house near the pub, whereas Ian, for the most part, would stay in the flat above the pub, he said, for security reasons. So after he gave his statement about what he had been doing that night, the police decided to go and speak to his girlfriend. However, very interestingly, when they did, they found that her account of that night was completely different to Ian's. She said that they were supposed to be meeting that evening. She was supposed to be going over to his flat at around 7 p.m, which was the time that she usually went over. But she said that before their meeting, Ian rang her and said that she couldn't come over the normal time. She had to wait and come over a bit later, around like 8:30 p.m. I don't believe he said why on the phone call, but regardless, the girlfriend listened and she went over at 8:30. But when she arrived, Ian wasn't even there. In fact, the police soon determined that Ian didn't come back to his flat, come back to the pub until about 10:20 p.m. that evening. So he had lied to the police. His alibi was that he was with his girlfriend in his flat that night, but he wasn't. And it was after this that the police, of course, became even more suspicious of Ian Sims, because why would he lie unless he had something to hide? Something else that made them really suspicious was that when the police were questioning Ian, they actually noticed that he had some injuries on his neck. He had some scratches on his neck, and so they asked him how he got them. His response was that his wife gave them to him. He said that she had recently found out about his affair and she got angry and she scratched his neck. Although when the police asked his wife about this, she said that that was a lie. She never scratched his neck. So the police confronted Ian with this and they said, your wife has said that this isn't true, that never happened. And so he changed his story. He said that he actually got the scratches whilst he was trying to break up a fight between two women in the pub a few days earlier. These two women, he said, were Helen McCourt and that drunk woman that she had an argument with that night. So the police spoke to that woman. However, she also said that that wasn't true. Neither she nor Helen got physical with Ian. They didn't scratch him. His story about how he got these injuries just kept changing. So naturally, the police started thinking that if he was involved in whatever had happened to Helen, if he maybe attacked and killed her, he probably sustained these injuries, these scratches, during a violent struggle. Another piece of information that the police later received in the investigation that also implicated Ian Sims and also suggested that there had been some kind of violent struggle was that a man, a member of the public, came forward to the detectives saying that on the evening of the 9th of February 1988, shortly after Helen would have gotten off her bus and started her walk home, he remembered hearing a woman's scream that was coming from the direction of the rear door to the George and Dragon pub. But he only heard it for a few moments before it just suddenly stopped. It sounded like it had been abruptly cut off, perhaps from where someone had maybe put their hand over the woman's mouth to silence her. So the police started to theorize that maybe this was Helen. This was Helen screaming, and the person who silenced her was Ian Sims. Now, despite just how suspicious he looked, Ian was denying everything. He was still being interviewed by the police, and he said that he was innocent. He said that he had absolutely nothing to do with the disappearance of Helen McCourt. However, the police were pretty certain at this point that he was responsible, and so they knew that they needed to find solid evidence to prove that he was involved. Otherwise, they would have to let him go. So they decided to search his car to see if they could find any evidence in there relating to this case. And they did. In Ian's car, they actually discovered blood, traces of blood, and also an earring, just one earring, although the back of the earring was gone, it was missing. Now, the police took this earring to Helen's family. They showed it to her mum to see if she would recognize it, and she immediately did. Mary said that it looked exactly like the earring Helen was wearing on the day that she went missing, and now it had been found in Ian Sims' car. So it was following this discovery when 31-year-old Ian Sims was arrested. And even though Helen hadn't been found, her body hadn't been found, he was actually arrested on suspicion of abduction and murder just days after Helen was last seen alive. And it turns out that the blood and Helen's earring in his car was literally just the tip of the iceberg. So much more evidence was to come. Alongside his car, the police and a forensic team also conducted searches of the George and Dragon pub and his flat above the pub. Now, traces of blood were discovered in a number of different areas in his flat. They found blood spots on the door to his flat, on the door hinge. They found blood on the stairs leading up to his flat. Traces of blood were found in one of the bedrooms, and the police actually discovered a fingerprint in one of the blood spots that they found, and this print was a match to Ian Sims. They also found in either Ian's flat or the pub the back of Helen's earring. The earring that was found in his car, if you remember, I said that the back was missing. Well, not anymore. The police found it on Ian's property. So they had found quite a substantial amount of evidence. It was really beginning to pile up at this point, but what the police still hadn't found was Helen. They were pretty confident at this point that she was dead. The blood in the car and in the pub indicated that she had been murdered by Ian. But where was her body? Ian clearly had no intention of telling them. Despite the evidence against him, he was still denying everything, so the police had to keep looking for her. On the 12th of February 1988, so just 3 days after she was last seen, this investigation was moving very quickly. On the 12th of February, the police appealed to the public for help. They asked members of the public to volunteer their time to assist in the searches for Helen, because the police obviously wanted to find her as quickly as possible, and the more people that were out looking, the better chance they had. And so many people came forward to help. About 2,000 people turned up to assist with the searches. They went out searching local fields and woodlands and footpaths, just anywhere and everywhere in Billinge that the police could think of where someone might have tried to hide a body or perhaps dispose of evidence such as Helen's clothing. And evidence relating to this case was actually found, although not in Billinge where the searches were mainly focused. About 15 miles away from Billinge, in a village called Hollands Green in Cheshire, a man walking his dog, I believe near a field or a wooded area, came across a towel just discarded on the ground, and this towel had blood on it. He continued looking around the area and he quickly discovered a second bloody towel, some pillowcases, and also some men's clothing like some socks, underwear, a sweatshirt, etc. And because there was blood on a couple of these items, the man contacted the police to report what he had found, and these items were collected. Now, the police who collected these items didn't immediately think that they could have been connected to the Helen McCourt inquiry, because obviously they were found 15 miles away, and they were collected by the Cheshire police force who weren't involved in Helen's case. So the Cheshire police collected them and they stored them as evidence, but they had no idea at the time what they could have been linked to. But eventually the connection was made because of something that was actually on the men's sweatshirt that was found. This sweatshirt linked to the George and Dragon pub because it was promoting a beer that was on sale in the pub at the time. So this sweatshirt, which linked to the main suspect, Ian Sims, had been found just dumped 15 miles away amongst some other items of clothing which probably also belonged to Sims, and also some bloody towels. So as you can tell, the police had a lot of blood related evidence in this case. They had the traces of blood that they found in Ian Sims' car, which just just as a side note, he tried to claim was his dog's blood. He said that his dog had cut its paw in the car and it bled. But they also found blood in his flat, and now they had these bloody towels and blood-stained clothing as well. All of this blood evidence they could link back to the main suspect, Ian Sims, but the police needed to find out whose blood it actually was. They needed to determine whether or not it was Helen's. Now, obviously, Helen still had not been found. They still had not found her body, so they couldn't get her blood to test against the blood evidence to see if it was a match. And so instead, what they had to do was go to Helen's family and get samples of their blood, since their DNA would obviously be incredibly similar to Helen's. So they took samples of blood from Helen's father, William, her mother, Mary, and her younger brother, Michael. And then their blood was tested and compared to the blood that was found on the towels in Ian's car and in his flat. And these tests concluded that the blood the police found was extremely likely to have come from the child of William and Mary McCourt. This was their daughter's blood. This was Helen's blood. And that was, of course, the police's biggest piece of evidence yet. DNA technology was still relatively new at the time. DNA profiling and genetic fingerprinting was new. This was 1988, so this was a huge breakthrough to have in the investigation. Helen's blood proved that she had been involved in a violent struggle with Ian Sims. Now, as part of their investigation into Ian Sims, the detectives were obviously interviewing the people in his life, and one of the people they interviewed was his cleaner, the cleaner of the George and Dragon pub. And this cleaner actually provided some very interesting information. She said that on the morning after Helen's disappearance, so the morning of the 10th of February, she turned up to work. She went to the pub to start cleaning as she normally did. However, when she arrived, Ian had beaten her to it. He was literally meticulously cleaning the whole pub from top to bottom by himself, which he had never done before. He always left that to the cleaner, and when the cleaner turned up for her shifts, usually Ian was still in bed in his flat. He told the cleaner that he was doing it that particular morning because his dog had made a mess in the pub. But clearly that was a lie. It was obvious to the police that he was cleaning it himself because he was trying to get rid of any evidence there might have been in there. In addition to this, the police also received some information from a local, and they said that shortly after Helen was last seen on the evening of the 9th, he remembered hearing the sound of cleaning coming from inside the George and Dragon pub. So I think he heard like a hoover or a vacuum. And at the time, he did think it was quite odd because there wasn't usually someone cleaning in there at that time of day. About a month into the investigation, even more evidence was found when a young man was walking along a river called the River Irwell, roughly 20 miles away from Billinge. And near the river, he spotted something on the ground. It looked like a handbag. So he had a look through it, and inside he found an ID. It was Helen McCourt's ID. This was Helen's handbag that she had with her that day. So the police were called to the scene, and when they had a look around the area, they found even more items belonging to Helen. They actually found her clothing that she was wearing on the day that she disappeared. I believe it was her coat, her scarf, her shoes, and also a pair of gloves, like mittens. And they also found the second earring that she was wearing. And alongside all of these items, they also discovered a piece of electrical flex cable, and tangled up in this flex cable were human head hairs that were a match to Helen McCourt's hair. Now, in Helen's handbag, the police found a receipt from a chemist. It turns out that just before she got on her bus in St. Helens that evening, she went to a chemist to pick up a few bits that she needed. And most of these items that she brought from the chemist were found alongside her belongings inside her handbag, except for a toothbrush. She brought a toothbrush at the chemist, but it wasn't in her bag. However, it wasn't long before the police found it. During one of the searches of the pub, they discovered the toothbrush that Helen bought that day, proving that she had been inside the pub that night. And they also found another item that belonged to Helen in the pub, a hair clip that she was wearing, so it probably came out during the struggle. And they also discovered a clump of Helen's hair in the pub. Again, it was probably pulled out during some kind of violent struggle. If she was trying to get away from Ian and fight him off, he probably grabbed her by the hair to control her. Just quickly going back to Helen's clothing that was found, on her coat, scientists actually discovered carpet fibres, and these fibres matched the carpet from the George and Dragon pub. And they also discovered dog hair on her clothing that was a match to Ian Sims' dog. When Sims was arrested, a couple of items of his jewellery were taken by the police, including 2 rings and a bracelet, and when examined, scientists discovered mud on this jewellery, and it was established that this mud exactly matched the mud from the area in Hollands Green in Cheshire where the bloody towels and Ian's clothing was found, proving that he had recently been there. He was the one who dumped the evidence in Hollands Green. A shovel was also later discovered, discarded in an area called Rixton in Warrington, about 15 miles away from Billinge, and it was eventually determined that this shovel belonged to Ian Sims. It was probably the shovel that he used to bury Helen's body somewhere. After he buried her, he attempted to get rid of it by just dumping it 15 miles away. This shovel clearly indicated that that was what he did to Helen. He had buried her somewhere, but the police were still clueless as to where. The searches for her continued. Volunteers were still out searching. Divers searched rivers and canals. The police used diggers to search fields, but there was nothing. They still couldn't find her anywhere. And it must have just been so completely devastating for Helen's family, because at this point, they knew that Helen was dead. It was obvious from the evidence that she had met a horrific end. She had been murdered. So now all they wanted was to find her body so that they could give her a proper funeral and give her the burial that she deserved, but they just could not find her. And Ian was still denying everything. He clearly had no intention of cooperating with the police in any way, so all they could do was keep looking. Ian was obviously kept in custody whilst the police were building their case against him, and eventually he was charged with Helen's murder. And because he maintained his innocence, the case went to trial. The trial began about a year after Helen disappeared in February of 1989, and Sims pleaded not guilty. Now, the police and the prosecution knew that this could be a very tough trial. It was going to be difficult to secure a conviction because despite the huge amount of evidence they had, and they did have a lot, we've just gone through it all, from the clothing that was found, both Helen's clothing and Ian's clothing, to the bloody towels, the electrical flex cable, the blood in the pub and in Ian's car, Helen's hair, the witness statements that they had gathered a lot, but what they still did not have was Helen. So the prosecution had the very difficult task of trying to convict someone of murder even though there was no body. This was actually one of the very first times this had ever been attempted in the UK. The prosecution had to prove to the jury through the DNA evidence that Helen had been murdered by Ian Sims. The DNA evidence was the strongest evidence they had. The rest of the evidence, some people could argue, was really just circumstantial. So the trial began and the prosecution went through their version of events, what they believed happened to Helen based on the evidence that the police had obtained. They said that on the evening of the 9th of February 1988, Helen got off her bus at around 5:15 and she started her short walk home. As we know, during her journey, Helen would have walked past the George and Dragon pub, and the prosecution believed that as she was walking past, she was spotted by the landlord, Ian Sims, and he shouted to her and called her over. Like we discussed earlier, just 2 days before her disappearance, Ian kicked Helen out of the pub after she got into an argument with another woman in the toilet. And so it's been theorized that he called her over that day and he started talking to her about that whole situation. And he either forced her into the pub whilst it was closed, or he forced her into his flat, or she went in willingly. Maybe she wanted to clear the air about what happened and sort it out with Ian. It's believed from the woman's scream that was heard by that member of the public that the attack started pretty soon after Helen was last seen, and it's thought that the attack began on the stairs leading up to Ian's flat because Helen's blood was found on the stairs. It's believed he dragged Helen into his flat and there was a violent struggle between the two. Helen tried desperately hard to fight for her life that day. However, Ian soon grabbed that electrical flex cable and using it, the prosecution believe, he strangled Helen to death. And then once she was dead, he decided that he needed to get rid of her body. Blood evidence found inside his car indicated that at some point Helen's body was in there. It's theorized that he put her in there either later on that evening or early the next morning. He also grabbed a shovel and he drove to a location and buried her body. Where that location is, we don't know. And then following this, he tried to get rid of the evidence. He disposed of his clothing that he was wearing that day, he disposed of Helen's clothing, and he disposed of Helen's handbag and some bloody towels that he clearly used to try and clean up the scene. No one knows why Ian Sims decided to kill Helen that day. I think there's been a couple of different theories surrounding a motive. Some people theorize that they got into an argument about the fact that Helen had been barred from the pub and this argument just escalated and ended in him killing her. I also came across a theory online that Helen perhaps knew that Ian was cheating on his wife and having an affair, and that she maybe threatened to tell his wife, so he murdered her before she could do so. But also, I think there could be a strong possibility that this crime was sexually motivated. Earlier on in the video, we talked about how Ian thought of himself as a ladies' man and he would flirt with lots of different women in the pub, including Helen. But as I said, Helen wouldn't really react to this. I think for the most part, she would just completely ignore him. Maybe that day, Ian tried it on with her again, and when she turned him down, he got angry and murdered her. Maybe he even tried to sexually assault her, and when she resisted and she tried to fight him off, he grabbed the flex cable and strangled her. Now, Ian's defense during the trial is honestly one of the most pathetic and laughable defenses I think I've ever heard. He basically claimed that he had been framed. He was still obviously saying that he was innocent. He had absolutely nothing to do with Helen's murder. So to try and explain away the evidence against him, he said that someone else, another man, must have broken into the pub, broken into his flat, put on his clothes, murdered Helen in his flat, carried her body to the boot of his car. They must have then stolen his car and used it to transport Helen's body to a location, and then they buried her body with his shovel. And then they got rid of the clothes and the evidence and they just politely dropped his car back to the pub. I mean, how desperate must you be to resort to that as a defense? It's so ridiculous. So of course the jury did not believe him, and on the 14th of March 1989, at the end of his trial, Ian Sims was found guilty of the murder of 22-year-old Helen McCourt, and he was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 16 years. Now, despite the guilty verdict, this nightmare was obviously far from over for Helen's family. They still did not have full closure because they still did not have Helen back, and over the years they have continued to search for her remains. Even after the police eventually stopped, family and friends carried on. Every single weekend they would be out looking for Helen. They would search canals, woodlands, fields, quarries, but to no avail. They never found Helen, and she has never been found to this day, more than 3 decades later. Helen's mother Mary even wrote to Ian in prison. I think she sent him a letter about 3 years after he was convicted, and she begged him, literally begged him in this letter to just please tell her where she could find her daughter so that they could lay her to rest. And Ian did reply to her. He sent her a letter back, but his letter was apparently just really nasty, and he still refused to tell Mary where Helen was buried. Now, Ian Sims tried to appeal his sentence, I believe, a number of times over the years. He basically wanted a review into his conviction because he was still denying his involvement, and so he got what he wanted. There was a review into his case in 2004, about 14-15 years after he was sent to prison. During this review, the authorities went over all of the evidence against him, including the DNA and forensic evidence, and Ian was clearly hoping that now, all these years later, it would be found to be not accurate. The DNA evidence would be found to be not accurate, but actually it was the complete opposite, because obviously by 2004 DNA and forensic technology had improved a whole lot since the late 80s. So when new tests were carried out on the evidence, it just proved the police's case even more. The evidence against him was even stronger, even more concrete, so this majorly backfired on him. Ian's minimum term of 16 years in prison would have ended around 2005-2006 time, and I believe he did apply for parole a number of times, but each time he was denied. And in 2015, Helen's mother Mary actually launched a campaign. She campaigned for a change in the law in the UK because she believes that convicted killers should not be granted parole or even be considered for release if they refuse to give up the location of their victims' bodies, like Ian Sims was doing. She wanted a law named after her daughter, Helen's Law, to be introduced whereby murderers are not allowed out of prison until they tell their victims' families where they can find their loved ones' remains. The petition for Helen's Law received hundreds of thousands of signatures, and so it was put before Parliament, and it was announced that it would be going ahead, it would be implemented. However, it kept getting pushed back and delayed because of elections and Brexit, and very unfortunately, before Helen's Law came into place in November of 2019, Ian Sims was put before the parole board again, and they decided that he would soon be released from prison. As soon as Helen's mother heard about this, she urged the government to introduce Helen's Law before he could be let out, and she started a legal bid to keep him behind bars and have the parole board's decision overturned. However, sadly, this failed, and just 3 months later, in February of 2020, 63-year-old Ian Sims was released on licence after serving about 31 years in prison, which is just insane to me. This is a man who has never ever shown any ounce of remorse for what he did to Helen. He's never even admitted it, let alone show remorse. Despite the huge amount of evidence linking him to the crime, he has always denied being Helen's killer, and so he has never given up the location of her remains. So how is it fair for him to be let out? His victim's family has literally begged him to tell them where Helen is, and he won't. So I personally don't understand how the parole board can justify releasing him. From what I can gather, Helen's Law was enacted around early 2021 time. It received royal assent, so it is a law in place right now. It's also known as the Prisoners' Disclosure of Information About Victims Act, although I have a quote from an article about the law here that states, under the law, killers could still be released if no longer deemed a risk to the public even if they refuse to disclose information. But the parole board will be legally required to consider whether they have cooperated with inquiries as part of their assessment, which I thought was quite interesting. Reading that, it seems as though the law still can't prevent killers from being released just because they refuse to give up information such as the location of a body. However, they can be denied release if they just refuse to work with authorities and refuse to assist them in getting answers for the families, like Ian Sims. It's just awful that it didn't get implemented earlier, because if it had, Ian Sims would most likely still be in prison. He would have been refused release until he agreed to cooperate with the police. It just makes me so sad for Helen's mother. She did all that work, all that campaigning to try and stop Sims from being released until her daughter's remains were recovered, but it was unsuccessful, and he's just out there now. He's a free man. But having said that, I'm 100% sure that Helen's law will have such a positive outcome when it comes to other families of other murder victims. I actually read one article from October of 2021 that stated a convicted killer from the UK named David Harker, who was responsible for the death of a woman named Julie Paterson in 1998. He was refused parole in late 2021 under Helen's law because he has never told anyone what he did with Julie's body, and I believe he was the first killer to be denied parole under Helen's law. So Helen's law has made a hugely positive impact on the legal system and the justice system, but like I said, it's just such a shame that it got delayed and it wasn't in place before Ian Sims was let out. But that is it for this case. That is the case of 22-year-old Helen McCourt. I really hope that Helen's body is recovered one day soon so that she can be laid to rest and given a proper burial. It's so awful that her family have never been able to do that for her, and they've never gotten that closure. But yeah, that is it for this video. As always, please do let me know what you guys think of this case in the comments. I would love to hear your opinions. Also, let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. You can again let me know in the comments, or alternatively, I do have a case request form linked in the description box of all of my videos. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly.